Time for me since I usually do it on my phone. All right, so we're wrapping up our time talking about Buddhism. I hope you all enjoyed having our guest speaker last Sunday, having Josh here with us.
I watched the podcast.
Oh, good. And you enjoyed it?
I did.
Excellent, excellent. So we're going to kind of pick up where he left off. He had talked a little bit about his own practice and training within, really within a sub-sect, you might say, of Mahayana, although you might also think of it as a separate way of being Buddhist, known as the Vajrayana tradition. We're going to pick up with some of that. We're going to look at some other forms of Mahayana Buddhism. And we've got a lot to cover, so we're going to kind of rush through it. But we've already spent so much time on Buddhism, it's really time to kind of wrap it up and move on to our next religion. I want to remind you of a couple of things. Mahayana is the largest kind of grouping of Buddhists and really includes a whole kind of host of different types of Buddhism. So Theravada, which we talked about back in December, is, you might say, a very narrow path. It's a strict adherence to this Pali canon of scripture and to the practices that have been passed down as having been taught originally by Shakyamuni Buddha, the historical Buddha, Siddhartha Gautama. But Mahayana Buddhism has developed that teaching in many different ways and therefore developed many different schools of thought, many different forms of Buddhism that are all under this kind of large kind of umbrella, a large tent of Mahayana, which means the great vehicle or the greater vehicle. One of the things that we pointed out as already as being central or of importance to Mahayana Buddhism is this concept of emptiness. That all things are empty, nothing is, to use some philosophical language, self-subsistent, nothing maintains itself, nothing has a kind of inner essence that is its true being, that sustains it separate from other things and indefinitely. So nothing has that. Everything is empty in this way. Everything is therefore in a kind of relationship of codependence upon everything else. Everything is interconnected in this way because nothing has its own essence. Everything relies on everything else to exist for the time that it exists, which is always impermanent, which is never eternal. It's always changing, it's always passing away and becoming something new. Everything is in that state of flux. So what this means is there's a sense of interdependence of all things. If all things are empty, if emptiness is the truth of all things, then everything is in interdependence. And it also means, and Josh touched on this just a little bit, that you eventually have to let go of categories of kind of dualistic or dichotomous categories. So you'll sometimes hear Buddhists, and Josh talked about this, talking about emptiness leading to realization of non-duality. Because everything is interdependent on everything else, you can't make clear distinctions between one thing and its supposed opposite. because they share the truth of emptiness and interdependence. Now that's really vague, I know. So one way that we might think about this, and this is an important, I think an important point in the Mahayana tradition, is that Samsara and Nirvana, these are two different things, right? We're in Samsara, the cycle of suffering, of rebirth and redeath, right? And Nirvana is what we want to achieve. Nirvana is the end of that, the cessation of Samsara, the cycle of suffering, of rebirth and redeath. Well, emptiness and the non-duality that is a part of emptiness teaches us that in fact there is no nirvana and there is no samsara. Both are empty. And so to be in samsara, if you are a bodhisattva, is to be in nirvana. And to be in nirvana is to be in samsara. And we heard a little bit of this in that Heart Sutra that I read before Josh came. So that was, I think, 3 Sundays ago. Well, if it doesn't make sense, it's probably because I'm not explaining it very well. And I wish we had more time to get into it. We don't, but one thing that's important is to understand that emptiness is not a kind of nihilism necessarily, which is how some people understand Buddhism, that everything's empty so nothing means anything, everything is basically just going to crash and burn into itself. And yet what you hear from Buddhists is that this is actually a joy and compassion producing philosophy or perspective. Because you realize that all sentient beings might be stuck in the mire of dukkha, of suffering, and causing suffering themselves, and yet all sentient beings, because dukkha is empty, because suffering is empty, because even evil is empty, all sentient beings are also already Buddha nature. Right? The duality is taken down. So you can treat all sentient beings as Buddha or as Bodhisattva. Well, anyway, that's an important point of Mahayana. And I've already mentioned the Bodhisattva, and that's where we'll pick up. The Bodhisattva is an important concept in Mahayana. And I mentioned this a few Sundays ago, that you remember in the Pali Canon, the Buddha in his previous lives is referred to as a bodhisattva, the Pali term for this, because he's on his way to nirvana. He hasn't reached it yet, but he's getting closer and closer. And then in his historical life as Siddhartha Gautama, he finally reaches nirvana or nirvana, and then at his death, parinirvana, so that he is no longer reborn. So Bodhisattva is a way of referring to him in his previous lives as he's moving towards this goal. But Bodhisattva in Mahayana becomes a much, you might say, richer category, in the sense that there are all sorts of bodhisattvas in this world and in various other worlds. Celestial bodhisattvas, human bodhisattvas, and anyone, just like Josh, my friend Josh has done, can take the bodhisattva vow and start on the road to being a bodhisattva, the vow to forestall nirvana and parinirvana for the sake of helping all sentient beings reach the goal. And you can do that now, even even if you know in this lifetime you're not going to even come close to reaching nirvana yourself. You can already start on the bodhisattva path. Well, so what are the characteristics? Bodhisattva means a being of perfect knowledge or a being of perfect wisdom, perfect understanding. So the characteristics of a bodhisattva is that they are if you see a Bodhisattva, you will see someone who is characterized by perfect giving, perfect morality, perfect patience, perfect exertion or energy, action, perfect meditation or mind cultivation, and perfect wisdom. Bodhisattvas can be understood within the Mahayana framework because of another doctrine that developed in Mahayana known as the Trikaya, or the three Buddha bodies. The first of these is the Nirmanakaya, or the transformation body. This is the body of an historical Buddha, like Shakyamuni Buddha, Siddhartha Gautama. So when he was alive in that specific historical period and, rejecting his life as a prince and going out and training under these various teachers and eventually sitting beneath the Bodhi tree and coming to Nirvana and teaching. This is his transformation body. Another body is the Sambhogakaya, or the enjoyment body. This is the body of celestial Buddhas and Bodhisattvas. We'll talk a little bit more about some of them, but these are those who have reached Nirvana, or Bodhisattvas who have forestalled their attainment of Nirvana, who exist in a higher realm than human beings do. And in fact can create their own worlds, which are sometimes referred to as pure lands, in which they can meditate and bring others to teach them. So in this life, in this world, you're not going to meet one of these celestial Buddhas or Bodhisattvas except in visions. That's how they will come to you. And then there's the Dharmakaya, or the Dharma body. This is kind of the truth underlying all Buddhas, all Bodhisattvas, the true body. This is, in some sense, this is associated with the Buddha nature that is available to all sentient beings, but realized in each Buddha and Bodhisattva. All right, so what is a Bodhisattva? And I said, the most kind of straightforward way of understanding the Bodhisattva is here's someone who has started down this path towards enlightenment. They've come to the point of enlightenment. They've been enlightened, but instead of going forward into full attainment of Nirvana or Parinirvana after death, they have forestalled entrance into Parinirvana so that they can remain in Samsara, in this world of the cycle of death and birth and rebirth and re-death, for the sake of all sentient beings, to help them along the path. That's the straightforward understanding. But I've also already indicated what you might think of as the higher understanding, which you can find in such sutras as the Diamond Sutra, where you realize that samsara is emptiness, nirvana is emptiness, thus there's no duality between samsara and nirvana, and the Bodhisattva has attained nirvana within samsara and maintains nirvana within samsara, and within nirvana enters back into samsara. The Bodhisattva realizes that there's no difference. And so he can be simultaneously in nirvana and samsara.
All shall be saved.
Right, and always seeking the salvation of all sentient beings. So some of and there's more than I could possibly list, but I'm going to raise up to you some of the Bodhisattvas, Buddhas, and celestial Buddhas that are popular. Of course, Shakyamuni Buddha, Siddhartha Gautama, sometimes known as the Tathagata. Now, for Theravada Buddhists, he's gone. Right? He died long ago, and when he died, he attained Parinirvana, Nirvana without remainder, never to be reborn again. We have no access to him, we only have access to his teachings, which can lead us down the same path. For Mahayana Buddhists, however, because of their understanding of this, of emptiness, and because of their understanding of the Bodhisattva, the celestial Buddha, who's both within and within Nirvana and within Samsara at the same time, you do have access to Shakyamuni Buddha. And some Mahayana groups will worship him like a god. Now, Theravada will not, right? And think that that's going to distract you from true practice. But some Mahayana will worship Shakyamuni Buddha as a god and call on him for divine favors and to help them in their meditation or so on. The next one is the Bodhisattva, who I couldn't pronounce a few Sundays ago, and I'll see if I can do it now. Avalokitesvara is a very important Bodhisattva, and he's kind of known as the ideal embodiment of Buddhist compassion. And again, this is a Bodhisattva who's a celestial Bodhisattva, and he's appealed to by devotees to help them, to cure ills, to help them in their meditation. In the same way that say a deva in Hinduism might be appealed to, or a god in some other cultures might be appealed to. He's a he. In Mahayana and many forms of Mahayana Buddhism, but when Mahayana makes its way into China, he becomes a she, gets a slightly different name, and becomes a female Bodhisattva in China and Japan. Another one is Amitabha, or Amida Buddha. This is the Buddha of infinite light. He's one of these celestial Buddhas who's created a pure land for practitioners, and we'll come back to that a little bit later. But he's got this Sambhogakaya, or enjoyment body. So you're not going to meet him on the road, Amida Buddha, but he may come to you in a vision. And the final one that I want to mention is Maitreya Buddha. Jack brought me this last week. This is a beer bottle, but if you see, there's a fat jolly Buddha here as part of the beer bottle. Now, I don't know what Buddhists who take a vow of not taking intoxicants would think of the Buddha being on a beer bottle, but here it is, Lucky Buddha brand beer. And this seems to be the image of the Buddha that most people know, right? The kind of bald, fat, jolly Buddha. This is not Shakyamuni Buddha. This is not the Buddha that we learned about, the historical Buddha. This is Maitreya Buddha. This is the Buddha yet to come, who there's an idea in some forms of Mahayana that as we move through different ages of the world, this will sound similar to some things that we heard in Hinduism. You will see a decline in the Dharma to the point that people can no longer practice the Dharma, they can't truly meditate, they can't truly learn the Buddhist teachings, and things just get terrible in the world, and eventually Maitreya Buddha has to come and set the Dharma straight again and restore peace and prosperity and enlightenment to the world. And so some forms of Buddhism, Mahayana Buddhism, look towards the coming of Maitreya Buddha And that's why in some depictions, particularly in China, he is shown as being fat, because this is symbolizing prosperity, and he's joyful because he's restored the Dharma. This is not a Nirmanakaya. This is not a transformation body. This is not the body of a historical Buddha. And maybe that's why he's the one on a beer bottle, because maybe when he comes, Buddhists can drink beer again. I don't know, but anyway. All right, so let's move into some forms of Buddhism. And can somebody tell me the time, just so I know?
It's 20 of.
Okay. I think we're doing all right. So Vajrayana. This is the diamond vehicle. That's one way to translate that, or the thunderbolt vehicle. This is much of what Josh was talking about. His training has largely been in a school of Vajrayana Buddhism. This is also known as Tantric Buddhism. Now, I know Tantra comes, you say this word Tantra or Tantric, and Westerners have this idea about what that means, and it's usually a whole lot more exciting than what it actually means. All that it means is that Tantra developed in India. It was a way of saying there are physical practices we can do that can support and sustain our spiritual practices. So if we're seeking meditation and enlightenment through meditation, there are things that we can do, physical practices that we can do to assist that. Some of these are rituals. Some of these are making use of images. Some are making use of mantras. You know what mantras are? It's repeating certain phrases over and over again. There's a mantra connected to Avalokiteshvara, and it goes something like this: Om Mani Padme Hum, and it means behold the jewel in the lotus, right? And so sometimes you'll see these Vajrayana Buddhists just repeating that mantra over and over again. Mandalas, you all know about the mandalas made with the different colored sands, and they're very intricate. And then, of course, they're wiped away at the end to show impermanence and to show emptiness, right? These are practices mainly done within the Vajrayana school, or the schools of Vajrayana. Physical actions, astrology, so on and so forth. Vajrayana is the form of Buddhism principally that took root in Tibet. And of course now the Tibetan lamas have been forced out of Tibet, as you know, and so it's resettled in parts of northern and southern India and so on. And of course, just as in other forms of Buddhism, there's an emphasis not on simply learning these things by books, but having a teacher. You need to have a teacher, a guru, and their name for the gurus are lamas. It's just a Tibetan word for teacher, guru.
Is that what the Dalai Lama is?
The Dalai Lama is one of these, yeah. And he's also a living Bodhisattva. He's a Bodhisattva in a transformation body from their perspective. He's not the only one, there are others. So he has reached Nirvana, and he just keeps coming back to help He's also, by the way, a political leader, right? Because he was actually had a position of political leadership in Tibet. The Dalai Lama did before the Chinese forced him out, and so it was a theocracy, right? If you want to call it that, right? Because he is as a religious leader was also the political leader. And so, I see people debate all the time, and I don't have a position on it. I don't have a dog in this fight. But whether or not the Chinese were right to end a theocracy, or whether they were wrong to force an indigenous leader out of his position, I don't have a dog in that fight. But I know other people who very much have very strong opinions on that. All right. That's only one form, though, of Buddhism, and it's actually pretty small. We hear a lot about Tibetan or Vajrayana Buddhism because the Dalai Lama has been masterful at promoting himself in the West. But it's a very small portion of Buddhism as a whole and a very small portion of Mahayana. So let's talk about some of the others, particularly as Mahayana moved into China and Japan. Legend goes that a man named Bodhidharma, a bhikkhu or bhikshu named Bodhidharma, brought Mahayana Buddhism to China sometime around the 5th century AD. And from there, many different schools emerged, many different forms of Buddhism emerged. We can't talk about all of them. We're only going to talk about 3. The first is Pure Land Buddhism. I want to tell you about that because it's so different than some of the other stuff we've been learning about Buddhism. According to the teachers and the tradition of Pure Land Buddhism, the world has already entered into, long ago, had entered into this age in which the Dharma has declined to such a point that nobody can truly do meditation and understand the Buddhist teachings and reach enlightenment. It just can't happen. It doesn't matter how long you sit in meditation or whatever, you're not going to get there. But we do have hope because there is this celestial Buddha known as Amitabha or Amida Buddha who has created a pure land for his devotees. And so what we need to do in this life is call upon the name of Amitabha or Amida Buddha with faithful sincerity and recite the phrase Hail to Amida Buddha or homage to Amida Buddha. And if we do this with sincerity and faithfulness, when we are reborn in the next life, he'll make sure that we're reborn in this pure land, this kind of heaven that he has made for us. And there he will teach us how to meditate, and we'll be able to attain enlightenment through a long life in his pure land. So in this life, you just give your devotion to Amitabha or Amida Buddha, and you say homage to Amida Buddha, and you really mean it, and in the next life you'll have the chance to actually seek enlightenment. It's not going to happen there. This might seem pretty far off, pretty strange development from the Buddha's original teaching, but it's not the only one like it. There's also Nichiren Buddhism. This started because the Lotus Sutra became extremely popular in China and Japan as the most important scripture that really sums up Buddhism and Buddhist doctrine. And this is a Mahāyāna Sutra, right? This isn't actually one of those Pali texts that goes back to the earliest but it's still held up as the most important. And the Tiantai school in China, which becomes the Tendai school in Japan, focused all of their attention on learning and reading, memorizing, meditating on the Lotus Sutra. But a Tendai teacher in Japan named Nichiren said, yeah, but we've entered that age of the decline of the Dharma. Are we running out of time?
It's 10:12 till.
Okay, I'm going to wrap it up. So he says we've moved into that age of the decline of the Dharma, and so it really won't even help us to read the Lotus Sutra anymore. What we need to do is simply say, "Hail to the Lotus Sutra," or "Homage to the Lotus Sutra," and this will give us good karma so that we will be reborn in a better state where we may actually in the future be able to seek enlightenment. We can't do it now. We can't even really understand the Lotus Sutra now. All we can really do is proclaim our devotion to the Lotus Sutra and hope in a later life that we will be able to reach enlightenment. And you might not think that this would catch on, but in fact it did, and it continues today. So I'm not sure if I'm going to say this right, but there's a school known as, or a form of Buddhism known as Sambhogakaya, which is a lay Buddhist movement, and it's based on Nichiren's teachings. It was founded in 1930, and it's gained popularity in Japan. It's come over to the United States also, so it's got some adherents in the United States. So these are two, I think, very different ways. They're still deeply in the tradition of Buddhism and can trace their lineage back to the Buddha, but have gone in a very different way than, say, the Theravada school. The last one that we want to talk about is Chan and Zen Buddhism. Now, Chan is the name of this school in China, and it eventually kind of went away in China. Zen is the name of it when it made its way over to Japan. And the name is based on the Pali and the Sanskrit words for meditation. Dhyana and Sanskrit jhana. And Pali becomes Chan in Chinese, and then Zen in Japanese. This is it rejects the notion that the Dharma is in decline, and we're wrapping it up, I promise. Zen rejects the notion that the Dharma is in decline, and says we can meditate, we can reach enlightenment now, and so it has a focus on meditation, but there are still different schools of this. So in Chan or Chan Buddhism in China, in the 7th century, there was the leader of a monastery, Hongren, who had to choose a successor as he came to his deathbed. He had this monk, Shinshu, who was going to be his clear successor. And he said, to prove that you're worthy of being successor, I need you to write a poem that explains enlightenment. And his poem was something like this. The body is the Bodhi tree, the mind is the mirror stand. Always keep the mirror clean, never let dust collect. And then the kitchen help in the monastery, a guy named Hui Ning, said, and I'm sure I'm not pronouncing that right, who was illiterate, heard this and said, well, that's not quite right. And so he had one of the monks write up his response to the poem, which goes something like, originally there is no Bodhi tree. the mirror does not need a mirror stand. All things are empty, so where can dust collect? And so as the story goes, the teacher was so impressed by this that he said, I really want to make you my successor, but you're the illiterate kitchen help, and if I do that, it's going to make everybody mad. So he gives him the robe showing that he's his true successor, and he says, now go start your own school, and I'm going to go ahead and pick the other guy to continue in this school. And the difference is the northern school of Shinshu focused on gradual enlightenment, whereas the southern school of Huinin focused on these kind of moments of sudden enlightenment. Okay, so that makes its way over into Japan, and in Japan we see a similar breakdown with the Rinzai school. This is in the 12th century AD. The Rinzai school also focuses on these moments of sudden enlightenment called satori, and these are brought about through a koan. So the teacher will often give the student a saying that's supposed to kind of break their conceptions and their senses of duality. And you've heard some of these. If a tree falls in the forest, it doesn't make a sound. What is the sound of one hand clapping? Which was addressed in a Simpsons episode, Bart did this. But anyway, does a dog have Buddha nature? These are some of the koans that are used in the Rinzai school. There's another school, the Soto school, created by Dogen, and this focuses on zazen, or sitting meditation, and it's much more disciplined. Well, they're both very disciplined, but it's much more focused on this. You sit and you don't move and you meditate. And somebody walks around with a bamboo cane, and if somebody's falling asleep or they move or something, they get whacked with the bamboo cane because you've got to stay focused. Okay, there's a third school, Zen Buddhism. We're not really going to worry about that. It's more of a mixture of Pure Land.
It's 5 till.
Okay, and so that is going to wrap up what we have to say about Buddhism. Next week we'll talk about, is Buddhism a religion and how does it compare to Christianity?